Hey everybody, welcome to the guided assignment for chapter 18. So this is activity-based department rate product costing and product cost distortions. So let's just hop into it. As usual with these kind of problems, we have a whole bunch of info here, I guess, almost too much, right? They really like to dump that info on us. And so let's just look at it. So Big Sound Inc. makes two products, receivers and loudspeakers. The factory overhead incurred is as follows. We have indirect labor, sub-assembly department, and final assembly department. And then the activity base associated with the two products is direct labor hours. And the indirect labor can be assigned in two different activities as follows: setups and quality control. Then it gives us activity-based usage quantities. So just tons of information. And so we just have to kind of work through it. So the first thing it tells us is that we need to determine the factory overhead rates under the multiple production department rate method. So we're not doing activity-based costing yet. It says assume that indirect labor is associated with the production departments so that the total factory overhead is 420,000 and 294,000 for the sub-assembly and final assembly departments respectively. Okay, so let's just look at these. So we have, let me get my calculator up here. All right. So for this first one, we have $420,000 in overhead for the sub-assembly department. It wants us to figure out our overhead per direct labor hour. So we can see that the sub-assembly department has 1,400 direct labor hours. So it's really just a matter of taking 420,000 and dividing that by 1,400 direct labor hours for $300 per direct labor hour. We'll do the same thing for the final assembly department where it's 294,000 in overhead. So I'll take 294,000 and divide that by 1,400 direct labor hours, or $210 per direct labor hour. All right, so there's our department rate when we base it on these overhead costs that are given to us here and the direct labor hours for each department that are given here. So then it says to determine the total and per unit factory overhead costs allocated to each product using the multiple production department overhead rates. So we calculated these rates here. We're going to round to the nearest cent. So our total factory overhead is is going to be, what we're going to do is, so we see that like receivers use 875 direct labor hours from subassembly and 525 direct labor hours from final assembly. We know that subassembly direct labor hours, we apply $300 in overhead per direct labor hour and $210 per direct labor hour for final assembly. So all we have to do to figure these out then is take our calculator, if I can get it to pop up here. And I'm going to say, okay, subassembly. So for receivers, I'm going to say this is 875. Actually do it this way. Oops. Okay, I'm making this harder than it has to be. All right, 875 hours times 300 per hour plus 525 hours times $210 per hour. And that should be our total factory overhead, $372,750 for receivers. I'm going to do the same thing for the loudspeakers. We'll do 525 times 300 plus 875 times 210. 525 times 300 plus 875 times 210. 341, 250. And then our factory overhead per unit is just to take this total factory overhead divided by the number of units produced. So our factory overhead for receivers, 372, 750 divided by 7,000 units produced gives us $53.25. Something seems a little off. Nope, that seems right. 53.25. And then for loudspeakers, 341, 250 divided by 7,000 units gives us $48.75. Okay, so this should be our production department rate, and then our total factory overhead, and then our factory overhead per unit using the multiple production department rate method. I'm going to check my work, make sure I didn't make any mistakes, and I look like I'm good. So the next thing we're supposed to do is determine the activity rates, assuming the indirect labor is associated with activities rather than with the production departments. Remember, our overhead was broken into 3 categories. Okay, we had indirect labor, then we had the sub-assembly department and the final assembly department. So what they're telling us is up here, what we did is we used that indirect labor to help us calculate the rates, and then use those rates to help us calculate our overhead, how we were going to spread our overhead out. But here, what we're going to do is assume indirect labor comes from these activity rates. So the 2 types of activities we have are setups and quality control. And we know that we have a total of 400 setups and a total of 2,200 inspections, which are part of the quality control. Setups are budgeted at $138,600 of overhead, and quality control are $261,800 of our indirect labor overhead. So to find these rates, all we have to do is take this amount, 138,600, and divide that by the total number of setups, which is right here, which is 400. So we're saying we're going to allocate overhead expenditures at a rate of $346.50 per setup. We can do the same thing for our quality control. We know we've allocated $261,800 in indirect labor to quality control, and we have 2,200 total inspections. So we'll say 261,800, divide that by 2,200 total inspections. We get $119 per inspection. And then our sub-assembly overhead costs and our final assembly department overhead costs, it says to use direct labor hours. Okay, so where does it tell us that? The activity base associated with the 2 production departments is direct labor hours. Okay, so I'll take this sub-assembly department cost of $198,800 and divide that by the 1,400 direct labor hours. You get $142 per direct labor hour. We'll do the same thing for final assembly. We'll say final assembly is $114,800. They also had 1,400 direct labor hours. Divide that by 1,400, $82 per direct labor hour. Okay, so now they want us to determine the total and per unit cost assigned to each product under an activity-based costing method. So to do that, in essence, we're going to have to say, for receivers, the number of setups times the cost per setup, the number of inspections times the cost per inspection, the number of direct labor hours in subassembly department times the cost per, or I should say, and it's not cost, but the amount allocated per, and then the number of direct labor hours in the final assembly department times that cost per direct labor hour. I think it's a little bit easier to work this problem out using Excel. I'm going to show you how I would do that. I'm sure some of you are very comfortable with Excel and others less so. So let me walk you through how I would do this if I was doing this for actual work. All right, so I've got my Excel spreadsheet. And in essence, I'm just going to say my activities, setups, quality control, I'll just call that QC, subassembly, direct labor hours, and final direct labor hours. Those are my 4 activities that I'm dealing with here, okay? My activity rate is $346.50 per setup, $119 per quality control inspection, $142 per subassembly department direct labor hour, and $82 per final assembly direct labor hour. So now I can say, because I'm trying to find the total cost for receivers, okay? So for receivers, I can say, well, how many setups were there in the receivers? And there were 80. How many quality control inspections? There were 450. How many subassembly direct labor hours? 875. I'm getting all of this right here. And then how many final assembly direct labor hours? There were 525. And now I just multiply it, right? The rate times the number of setups. And here's where Excel gets better, is I can use this fill tool and just have all that multiplication done for me. And then I can add it up and know that my total cost, or my total overhead allocated for receivers, was $248,570. For my loudspeakers, I had 320 setups. I had 1,750 inspections. Wow, so a lot more going into it. 525 subassembly direct labor hours, and 875 final assembly direct labor hours. Again, I'll just multiply the rate times the quantity. And again, I can see my total cost, 465, 430. And then to do my activity-based or activity cost per unit, I could know up here that I produced 7,000 units of each. So I'll say the units, 7,000. My cost per unit. The total cost divided by the number of units. The receivers had an activity cost of $35.51 per unit. And $66.49 for loudspeakers. Check my work. I think I got that all right. The last part, it wants us to, I guess, talk through this and make sure we understand it. So we're going to say the activity-based overhead allocation reveals that loudspeakers are blank costly on a per unit basis than are the receivers. So we're going to say the loudspeakers are more costly, right? They're quite a bit more costly. The multiple production department rate method determines that the per unit factory overhead is blank for the two products. And our options are nearly the same or quite different. And we'd say, well, they're within like $5, $4 and something. So I'm going to say nearly the same. The multiple production department factory overhead rate method blank distort the unit cost. So it does distort the unit cost because it is all factory overhead is assumed to be blank to direct labor hours. We're going to say proportional, right? Because when we used this this multiple production department rate, we just did everything based on direct labor hours. Even though when we did more detail and found out that like the setups and the quality control were a major part of the cost, we found out that there was a lot of distortion, right? So loudspeakers have blank setups and inspection activities than do receivers, we'll say more, right? Because the loudspeakers had way more setups. Thus, loudspeakers have blank activity costs than do receivers, higher activity costs. And we'll check our work and we're good. So hopefully that helps you with the work for chapter 18 and hopefully, hopefully you do well on it. So have a great day and good luck on the rest of the work.